He built the crib first. Before the porch rail that needed fixing, before the second coat of paint on the barn, before anything else that a sensible man would call urgent, Amos Calder built a crib out of good oak and set it in the corner of a room that had no mother to fill it. That was a thing folks in town understood wrong about him. They believed he ordered himself a wife, the way a man orders a plow blade or a length of good rope, something to fill a gap and keep the machinery running. What they did not know, what nobody but Amos and the quiet grief he carried in his chest could have told them, was that he was not looking to fill a gap at all. He was looking for someone who could stand in a house full of silence and not flinch from it. If you have ever lost something you built your whole life around, stay with this one. It is not the story you think it is. The Calder place sat at the end of a long dirt road, 300 acres of wheat and stubborn soil, a house with good bones and a barn that had outlived 2 roofs already. Amos had inherited it from a father who believed land was the only thing a man could trust, and after burying his wife 2 winters back, Amos had come to believe the old man was right. Land did not leave you. Land did not go quiet in the night and never wake again. Land just sat there, patient, waiting for a man to put his hands in it and forget, for a few hours at least, that his house had gone empty. He had 2 children. Ellie was 7, all elbows and questions, the kind of boy who followed his father everywhere and asked why the sky did what it did. June was 4, and she had stopped talking much since her mother passed, which worried Amos more than he let anyone see. He fed them, he clothed them, he tucked them into beds that used to have another set of hands smoothing the quilts. And every night he sat at the kitchen table with a ledger and told himself that this was enough, that a man could raise children on love alone, even if that love came out plain and quiet, and mostly through the work of his hands. But a house needs a woman's rhythm in it, his sister told him more than once, standing in his kitchen with her hands on her hips like she was inspecting a fence line. Not a woman's touch, mind you. His sister was not sentimental. A woman's rhythm, she said. The way things get done without a man having to think on them. Bread rising. Socks mended before the toes came through, a child's hair braided just so. Amos did not have that rhythm in him, and after 2 years of trying, he had come to accept that some things a man simply could not learn, no matter how many mornings he tried. So when the advertisement came through in a newspaper, his sister left folded open on the table, a notice placed by a woman out east, looking for a fresh start and a household in need of steady hands. Amos read it 3 times before he let himself consider it. He was not a romantic man. He did not believe in the sort of love that came fast and burned itself out. He believed in reliability, in a person's word holding weight, in a bargain struck plain and kept plain. He wrote to her not as a man seeking a wife, but as a man seeking a partner in the raising of 2 children who had already lost too much. He told her the truth of his circumstances, the acreage, the animals, the 2 children who needed steadier ground beneath them. He did not embellish. He did not pretend the house was warmer than it was. Her name was Sarah Whitfield, and her reply came back within the month, written in a clean, unhurried hand that told him something about the woman before he ever met her. She did not ask about his appearance or his temperament. She asked about the children's ages, their habits, whether the well ran dry in summer, whether there was a school within reasonable distance. Practical questions. Amos found himself reading her letter twice, then a 3rd time, not for what it said, but for what it did not say. There was a carefulness to her words, a woman choosing each one like a person crossing a river on stones. She had tested herself. He did not know yet what she was being careful about. He only knew that something in her restraint matched something in his own, and that felt, in a strange way he could not name, like the beginning of an understanding. What Amos did not know, what he could not have known, from a handful of letters exchanged across half a country, was that Sarah Whitfield was not simply a widow seeking a fresh start. She was a woman running from something, though running was not quite the word for it, not the way she thought of it, in the small hours when sleep would not come. She was walking away from something deliberately, with her eyes open, and she had chosen the Calder advertisement because it asked for exactly what she had left to give: hands willing to work, a mind willing to manage a household and no promises about the heart. She had buried a husband of her own 5 years back, and what she had learned in the years since was that some truths, carried too soon into a new life, could poison it before it had a chance to take root. She packed one trunk. She left behind a name that some people in her old town still spoke with a particular tightness in their jaw, and she boarded a train westward, believing that distance was a kind of mercy both for herself and for whoever might be foolish enough to build a life alongside her. The morning she arrived, Amos stood at the station, with his hat in his hands, feeling every bit the fool his sister had warned him he might feel. He did not know what he expected. Perhaps some soft, uncertain creature stepping down from the train car, eyes darting for reassurance. What stepped down instead was a woman of middling height, dressed plain but neat, carrying her own trunk before the porter could reach it, her gaze moving over the platform with the quick, assessing calm of someone taking stock of a field before deciding where to plant. She found him without needing to be told which man he was. Perhaps it was the two children pressed against his legs, June's small hand fisted in his trouser leg, Eli standing a half-step ahead, like he meant to do the introducing himself. "Mr. Calder," she said. And it was not a question. "Miss Whitfield." She looked at him a moment longer than politeness required. And Amos had the strange sensation of being read the way a person reads a ledger checked against some private column of figures he could not see. Then she looked down at the children. "You'll be Eli," she said to the boy. "And you'll be June." She said it plainly, without the syrupy voice groan folks sometimes used on children they did not know how to talk to. June did not answer. She rarely did those days. But she did not hide her face either, and Amos noted that, filed it away the way he filed away most things that mattered, without comment. The ride back to the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that was not empty so much as full of things not yet said. Sarah watched the land pass by the wagon, wheat fields going gold in the late summer light, fence lines that needed mending, a windmill turning slow and patient against a sky threatening rain by evening. Amos watched the road and said little, and if he stole a glance at her now, and then checking the set of her jaw, the way she held her hands folded in her lap like a woman used to keeping herself still, he told himself it was only natural curiosity about the person who would now share his table and his roof. "The house is plain," he said finally, because the silence had gone on long enough that he felt he owed her some warning. "It's been plain a while now." "Plain suits me," Sarah said. "I've no use for fuss." He almost smiled at that. Almost. When they came up the last rise and the house showed itself, weathered and sturdy against the darkening sky, Sarah did not say anything for a long moment. She looked at it the way a person looks at a thing. They intend to understand fully before they let themselves feel anything about it. Then she climbed down from the wagon before Amos could offer his hand, and she picked up her own trunk again, and she said the only thing she would say about the house that whole first evening. "It'll do," she said. "Now show me where the kitchen is. Children need supper, and it's getting late." Amos stood there a moment in the yard, hat still in his hands, watching her walk toward his front door, like she had always meant to arrive at it. He did not know yet about the letters she had not sent, the ones sitting unfinished in the bottom of her trunk, addressed to a town she had left behind, and a truth she was not yet ready to speak. He did not know about the money that was owed somewhere, or the name that would come looking for her. Eventually, the way certain debts always do. He knew only that his kitchen, cold and quiet for 2 years, was about to have someone standing in it besides himself, and that the children, walking behind her now, seemed to be moving with something like purpose for the first time since their mother died. Cod. And he followed them inside, and behind him the sky finally broke, rain coming down soft and steady over the wheat, the kind of rain that soaks in deep and does not run off. His sister would have called it a good sign. Amos was not a man for signs. But he noticed it, anyway, the way he noticed everything, filing it away in that quiet ledger he kept of things that mattered, waiting to see what sum they would eventually make. The first weeks settled into a rhythm neither of them named aloud, though both of them felt it taking shape the way a plowed field takes shape under a careful hand, row by row, without hurry. Sarah rose before the sun most mornings, and by the time Amos came in from the barn with his boots caked in mud and his breath fogging in the cold, there was bread proofing near the stove and coffee dark enough to stand a spoon in. She did not ask him how he liked his eggs or whether he preferred his coffee sweet. She watched him the first few mornings, noted what he ate and what he left on the plate, and adjusted without comment until the food on his plate matched what his hands reached for without thinking. Amos noticed this the way he noticed most things about her. Quietly, without remark, filing it into that private ledger where he kept the sum of a person's character. Eli took to her faster than Amos expected, though perhaps that should not have surprised him. The boy had been starved for someone to answer his endless stream of questions, with patience instead of exhaustion, and Sarah, it turned out, had an endless well of plain, unhurried answers. Why does bread rise? Why does the well never run dry even in August? Why did his mother have to go where she went? That last question came on a Tuesday evening, while Sarah was teaching him to mend a torn shirt sleeve, and Amos, standing in the doorway with an armful of firewood, went very still, waiting to hear how she would answer a question he himself had never found the words for. "I don't know," Sarah said, not looking up from the needle. "Nobody rightly knows why the ones we love get taken when they do. I lost someone too. Once, I still don't have an answer for it. But I'll tell you what I do know. The mending doesn't stop just because the hurt is big. You keep stitching, bit by bit. That's most of what living is." Eli was quiet a moment, watching her hands move the needle in and out. "Did it get easier?" he asked. "The hurt?" "No," Sarah said, plain as she said most things, "but I got stronger around it. There's a difference." Amos set the firewood down slower than he needed to, giving himself an extra moment in the doorway before he had to speak or be noticed. He had spent 2 years trying to explain his wife's absence to his children in words that made sense to a boy of 7 and a girl who had stopped talking altogether, and here was a stranger, in his own kitchen, saying the truest thing either child had heard on the subject, without dressing it up in anything soft. With Annie, June was the harder case, and both of them knew it without discussing it directly. The girl watched Sarah with the wary, assessing eyes of a child who had already learned that grown-ups could disappear. And she kept her silence like a small fortress she had built for herself and did not intend to abandon easily. Sarah did not push. She did not coax June with sweets or songs the way Amos's sister had tried, unsuccessfully, on her visits. Instead, Sarah simply made a place for June beside her at every task without demanding participation. When she needed bread, June sat on the stool nearby with a small lump of dough of her own, pressing it with her small fists, saying nothing, and Sarah said nothing back, only nodded, now and then like the work itself was a kind of conversation they were both fluent in. It was 3 weeks in, on a gray afternoon, with rain threatening again, that June spoke her first full sentence since her mother's death. Sarah was hanging wash on the line, and June was handing her the clothespins, one at a time, from a small tin bucket, and a sheet, half-pinned, caught a gust of wind and snapped loose, flapping wild against the gray sky. "It's trying to fly away," June said. Sarah went still, the way a person goes still when they understand they are witnessing something. They must not disturb by making too much of it. She did not gasp. She did not drop what she was doing and sweep the child into her arms, though something in her chest pulled hard in that direction. "Well," she said, catching the sheet and pinning it firm, "we'd better hold it down then. Can't have the wash running off to see the world without us." June almost smiled. "Almost." That evening, after the children were abed, Amos found Sarah on the porch, a shawl around her shoulders against the cooling air, looking out at the dark line of the fields where the wheat stood, heavy and waiting for harvest. He had heard about June's words from Eli, who had reported it at supper with the breathless importance of a boy delivering great news, and Amos had said little, only nodded, though something in him had loosened that evening in a way it had not loosened in 2 years. "She talked to you today," he said, coming to stand near the porch rail, not too close. "She talked to the wash," Sarah said, "but I'll take it." 2 years, Amos said. Not a word from her in 2 years, not since. He stopped himself the way he always stopped himself before he reached the place in his chest where his wife's name lived. Not since her mother. Sarah did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the dark fields. "Grief doesn't run on anyone's schedule but its own," she said. "You can't rush a child out of it any more than you can rush a field to ripen before its season. All you can do is keep tending it. Water it."
Wait.
"You talk like a woman who's tended a fair amount of grief herself." It was the closest he had come to asking her anything about her past, and he felt the question land between them like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading out before either of them could stop them. Sarah's hands, resting on the porch rail, went still. "I've had my share," she said, and there was something in the careful flatness of her voice that told Amos not to push further. Not yet. He was a patient man. He had learned patience the hard way, watching a wife waste away over a long winter, with nothing he could do but sit beside her and hold her hand and wait. He recognized the shape of a door being closed gently, not slammed, and he respected the difference. "Fair enough," he said, and let the silence settle back between them, comfortable enough, though not without its weight. Later that night, when the house had gone quiet and even the wind had settled, Sarah sat at the small writing desk in her room with a lamp turned low, and she took out a letter she had started weeks before and never finished. It was addressed to a lawyer in the town she had left, a man handling the affairs of her late husband's estate, and the words she had written stopped halfway down the page, trailing off where the truth got too heavy to carry any further in ink. She read what she had written. She did not add to it. She folded it back into the bottom of her trunk, beneath a false lining she had sewn in herself, and she blew out the lamp and lay in the dark listening to the house settle around her, the particular creaks and sighs of a home that was slowly, cautiously, beginning to feel less like a stranger's and more like her own. She had not lied to Amos Calder. She wanted to hold on to that distinction, turning it over in her mind the way a person turns over a coin to check both its faces. She had simply not told him everything. There was a difference, she told herself. Though even in the privacy of her own thoughts, the distinction felt thinner than she wanted it to be. Somewhere behind her, in the town she had left, there was a debt that had not been settled, a name that men with sharp suits and sharper voices had not forgotten, and a piece of land that some believed still belonged to her, though she had left believing otherwise. She had come west to build something clean, something unencumbered by what had come before. She had not counted on how quickly a house could start to feel like a place worth protecting, or how much harder that made the keeping of secrets. Autumn came on hard and fast that year, the wheat cut and stored, the air turning sharp enough to bite at exposed skin during the morning chores. It was in this season, with the harvest safely in and the family beginning to feel, for the first time in a long while, something like an ordinary rhythm, that the first visitor arrived to disturb the quiet Sarah had worked so carefully to build. He came on a gray afternoon in a hired buggy, a man in a city coat too fine for the dust of a farm road, and Amos, coming up from the barn, watched him climb down with the particular unease of a man who recognizes trouble before it has said a single word. The stranger introduced himself as Mr. Reginald Price, a name that meant nothing to Amos but that Sarah, watching from the kitchen window, went pale at the sound of her hands going still over the bread she had been kneading. "I'm looking for a Mrs. Sarah Whitfield," Price said, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of a man used to getting his way through charm rather than force. "I understand she may have taken up residence here." Amos did not answer right away. He had learned over the years that silence could do more work than a hasty word, and he used it now, studying the man's fine coat, his soft hands, the way his eyes moved past Amos to the house behind him as though already cataloging what he found there. "There's no Mrs. Whitfield," here Amos said finally, which was not quite a lie, since the woman in his kitchen had taken his name some weeks back in a quiet ceremony witnessed by his sister and the town's circuit preacher, though the marriage between them had been, so far, one of arrangement and respect rather than anything either of them had spoken of as love. Price smiled, the kind of smile that did not reach past his teeth. "Perhaps I'm mistaken," he said. "Though I understood a woman matching her description had recently married a farmer in this county, Sarah Calder, perhaps now." The name landed between them, and Amos felt something in his chest tighten, not with anger yet, but with the particular unease of a man realizing that the ground beneath him is not as solid as he had believed. "State your business," Amos said, "or get back in your buggy." Price studied him a moment, seeming to recalibrate whatever approach he had planned on the ride out. "My business," he said, "is a debt owed by the late Mr. Nend Whitfield's estate, a debt his widow was obligated to settle before she saw fit to disappear westward without so much as a forwarding address. I represent parties with a legitimate claim to certain assets, and I have reason to believe your wife has knowledge relevant to recovering them." "What sort of assets?" "That," Price said, "would be a conversation best had with the lady herself." It was at that moment that Sarah appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, her face composed into a calm that Amos, who had come to know her rhythms these past months, recognized as the particular stillness of a woman holding herself together through sheer will. She looked at Price for a long moment before she spoke. "Mr. Price," she said, "I wondered how long it would take you." "Sarah." He said her name. Like a man greeting an old friend, though the coldness beneath it was not lost on anyone standing in that yard. "You've made yourself difficult to find." That was rather the point. Amos looked between the two of them, feeling the shape of something he did not yet understand, taking form in the space between their words, and for the first time since she had stepped off that train he felt the particular chill of not knowing a person he had allowed into his home, into his children's lives, into the careful architecture of a family he had been rebuilding board by board. "I think," Amos said, "you'd better come inside. All of you, and somebody had better start explaining." Inside, with the children sent out to the barn under Eli's proud supervision, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her, and for the first time since her arrival, Amos watched her composure crack. Not shatter, but crack, the way ice cracks under a weight it was never quite built to bear. The truth, when it came in pieces the way most hard truths do, told not in one clean confession, but in fragments Sarah offered reluctantly, each one costing her something visible in her face. Her late husband, Thomas Whitfield, had not died the honest death she had allowed people to assume. He had died owing money to men who did not forgive debts easily. Men who had backed a business venture of his that had failed spectacularly, taking with it not only his fortune but a good portion of money belonging to investors who considered themselves owed regardless of what remained. When Thomas died, suddenly and without warning, of a weak heart that had perhaps been strained past bearing by the pressure of his failures, the debt had not died with him. It had transferred in the eyes of men like Price to his widow, along with an expectation that she would either produce the funds owed or surrender whatever assets she still possessed, chief among them a piece of land in the East that had been in her own family before her marriage, land that was not by any honest reading of the law part of Thomas's estate at all. "They came for me within a month of the funeral," Sarah said, her voice steady even as her hands folded on the table. "We're not Price and men like him. They wanted the land my father left me, though it had nothing to do with Thomas's debts. I refused. I had lawyers of my own. For a time, though lawyers cost money, I no longer had in abundance. When it became clear they meant to pursue the matter through means less concerned with what the law actually allowed, I decided the wisest course was to be somewhere they could not easily find." "So you ran," Amos said. It was not an accusation, not quite, but it landed with weight all the same. "I left," Sarah said. "There's a difference, though I understand if you don't see it that way just now, and the land is still mine, legally. Whatever Price says otherwise." Her jaw was tight, now the composure she had held on to through the telling, finally starting to fray at its edges. "I did not lie to you, Amos. I told you I was a widow seeking a fresh start. That much was true. I simply did not tell you what I was starting fresh from." Amos sat in silence for a long moment, turning this over the way he'd turned over most difficult things, slow and careful, unwilling to speak until he had weighed the full shape of it. "You let a man like that ride up to my house," he said finally, "and threaten claims against my family, and you never thought to warn me this might come." "I hoped it wouldn't," Sarah said. "I hoped I'd covered my tracks well enough. I was wrong." "I'm sorry for that, Amos. I am." But I'll not apologize for protecting what's mine or for wanting a life where I wasn't defined by a dead man's debt. There was a long silence between them, the kind that carried more weight than any argument could have. Outside, Amos could hear Eli's laughter drifting from the barn, June's higher, rarer laugh joining it now and then, the sound of two children who had, over these past months, begun to trust that their world was steady again. And here at his own kitchen table sat the woman who had helped steady it, revealed now to be carrying a storm behind her that had finally caught up. "What does he want?" Amos said finally. "Specifically, the deed to my father's land, signed over, or a sum of money I don't have and can't get." "He'll press. Men like Price don't ride this far for nothing. He'll threaten the courts, though I don't believe he has grounds. He'll threaten worse if the courts don't move fast enough for his liking." Amos was quiet a long moment, his eyes on the table between them, on the hands that had kneaded his bread and mended his children's clothes and taught his silent daughter to speak again through nothing more than patience and unhurried presence. He thought of the crib he had built before anything else in that house, the quiet hope it represented, a hope he had almost let himself believe was being answered. "I married you," he said finally, "not for the land you didn't tell me about, not for whatever debts follow you. I married you because my children needed steadier ground, and you gave it to them. That much hasn't changed, far as I can tell, whatever Price wants to claim about the rest." Sarah looked up at him, something in her face loosening, for the first time since Price's buggy had appeared on the road. "You're not angry." "I'm angry," Amos said. "Make no mistake, but being angry and turning you out are two different things, and I've never confused the one for the other." He stood moving to the window, where he could see Price's man still waiting by the buggy, patient as a vulture now. "You'd best tell me everything, all of it, from the start, because if that man means to come after what's yours, he'll find he's dealing with more than one set of hands this time." What Sarah did not know, sitting there at that table with the weight of her secret, finally out in the open air where it could breathe, was that Amos Calder was not a man who backed away from a fight once he understood what was worth fighting for. He had spent 2 years believing the only thing worth protecting on his land was the soil itself and the children who would one day inherit it. He was only now beginning to understand that a family could grow roots as deep and as worth defending as anything planted in the ground, and that the woman across the table from him, secrets and all, had become part of that family, whether either of them had planned on it or not. The days that followed Price's visit moved with the particular tension of a sky before a storm breaks, that heavy stillness where the air itself seems to hold its breath. Price did not leave the county. He took a room at the boarding house in town, and word of his presence and his purpose spread the way word always spreads in small places, through the grocer and the blacksmith and the women who gathered after church to trade news along with recipes. By the end of the week, most of the county knew that the widow who had married Amos Calder carried some manner of trouble behind her, and opinions on the matter split about as evenly as opinions on most things did. There were those who clucked their tongues and said they had known all along that a mail-order arrangement would end in some kind of scandal, that a man ought to know the full measure of a woman before he put his name and his children's future in her keeping. Amos's own sister, arriving unannounced one afternoon with a face set for battle, sat him down at his own kitchen table and asked him plainly whether he had lost his sense entirely, marrying a stranger who turned out to be running from creditors and lawyers and heaven knew what else. "She's no criminal," Amos said, his voice steady in a way that surprised even himself. "She's a woman who lost her husband and got left holding debts that weren't rightly hers to carry. There's a difference, and I'd thank you to see it. And if this Price fellow takes it to a judge, if he finds a way to make trouble for the children, for the land, for your good name, then we'll deal with it," Amos said, "same as we deal with drought or blight or a barn roof that won't hold. You don't run from trouble on this land, you meet it standing." His sister studied him a long moment, and something in her hard expression softened just slightly at the certainty in his voice. "You care for her?" she said. It was not quite a question. Amos did not answer right away. 2. He looked out the window toward the yard, where Sarah was hanging wash, despite the chill in the air, June beside her handing up clothespins one at a time, the two of them moving through the task with an ease that had not existed in that yard for 2 long years. "I care what she's built here," he said finally. "Whatever else is true about her past. That's worth defending, far as I'm concerned." But there were others in the county who saw the matter differently, and chief among them was Silas Grieve, who owned the largest mill in the region and had, for reasons of his own pride and old resentment toward Amos's father, never much cared for the Calder family's standing in the community. Grieve saw in Price's visit an opportunity, and he was not a man to let opportunity pass by unused. Within days he had made contact with Price, offering what assistance a man of his local influence could provide, not out of any concern for justice or debt, but because a Calder brought low, his reputation stained by scandal, would make for a very convenient thing indeed, particularly with a parcel of Calder land bordering Grieve's own that he had long wished to acquire. It was Sarah who noticed the shift first, the particular way gossip seemed to sharpen once Grieve's name entered the mix, the way Price's confidence, which had wavered somewhat after Amos's refusal to be cowed, seemed to firm up again with new backing behind it. She said nothing of her suspicions to Amos at first, turning the matter over privately, the way she turned over most difficult things, weighing what she knew against what she feared, until the evening Price sent word requesting a formal meeting at the boarding house, a meeting he insisted must include not only Sarah but Amos as well, given, as the note phrased it, certain complications that had arisen regarding the property in question. "Complications," Amos said, reading the note over her shoulder. "That's a fancy word for trouble." "It means Grieve's found a way to tangle my land up with yours," Sarah said. "I'd wager that's the shape of it. A shared boundary, an old survey dispute, something enough to give a corrupt judge grounds to freeze both properties pending resolution. It's an old trick. I've seen men like Price use it before. And if he succeeds, then we're both tied up in courts for years, our land held hostage, and men like Grieve free to make offers on properties too encumbered to refuse them." Her voice was flat, but Amos could hear the fear beneath it, carefully controlled, but present all the same. "I've seen this happen to better men than either of us. It's not about the law, not really. It's about wearing a person down until they'll sign anything, just to make the trouble stop." Amos was quiet a long moment, and then he said the thing that would define the shape of everything that followed, the thing that Sarah would remember, in later years, as the moment she understood fully what kind of man she had married. "Then we don't wear down," he said. "We stand together, whatever comes of it." It was not a grand speech. It was not the kind of declaration that got written into songs or repeated in town for its poetry. It was plain, practical, delivered the way Amos delivered most things that mattered, without ornament, and Sarah found that its plainness struck her harder than any flowery vow could have managed. She had spent months half expecting that when the truth came out, Amos would see her as Price and men like him saw her. A liability, a complication, a burden to be managed or discarded. Instead, he stood in his own kitchen and said the word together like it cost him nothing at all to include her in it, like it had never occurred to him that the word might not apply. The meeting at the boarding house, when it came, was a study in the particular arrogance of men who believe money and influence entitle them to whatever they set their sights on. Price sat at the head of a small table with papers spread before him. Grieve seated at his side with the satisfied posture of a man who believes he has already won. And across from them, Amos and Sarah sat with nothing but each other and the truth between them. "The matter is simple," Price began, sliding a document across the table. "A survey discrepancy suggests the boundary between the Whitfield land and the Calder property has never been properly established. Pending resolution, both properties will need to be held in trust, administered by a court-appointed party, until the matter is settled. Given the debts owed by the Whitfield estate, I believe you'll find it considerably simpler to resolve this quickly, by transferring the disputed acreage outright, rather than enduring what could be a lengthy and costly legal process." Amos did not reach for the document. He looked instead at Grieve, whose satisfaction was written plain across his face despite his attempt to appear disinterested. "Funny," Amos said, that a survey discrepancy should surface right around the time you took an interest in the matter, Silas. My father surveyed that boundary himself, 30 years back, with witnesses still living in this county who could speak to it, if a court cared to ask them. Greaves' satisfaction flickered just slightly. Old surveys are often imprecise, Price said smoothly, though something in his confidence had wavered at the mention of living witnesses. Modern methods often reveal modern methods paid for by men with an interest in the outcome, Sarah interrupted, and something in her voice had changed, the fear replaced now with a hardness Amos had not yet seen in her, a woman who had decided she was done being managed. I know how this works, Mr. Price. I watched you do it to my husband's business partners years back, before his debts ever became my burden to carry. You manufacture doubt where none exists, and you count on people being too tired or too frightened to fight it properly. That's a serious accusation. It's an honest observation, Sarah said, and I have something you don't, Mr. Price. I have witnesses of my own, from back east. People who watched you and men like you work this exact scheme on other widows, too broken by grief to fight back. I've spent the past several days writing to them. I expect their sworn statements within the fortnight. This was, Amos would learn later, not entirely true when Sarah first said it, though it would become true within days as she sent urgent letters to old acquaintances who had watched Price's methods firsthand and who, freed from the fear that had kept them silent while Sarah remained isolated and unsupported, proved surprisingly willing to speak once they understood she was no longer alone in the fight. But in that moment, sitting across the table from two men who had believed they were dealing with a frightened widow and a simple farmer too proud to understand what he was up against, Sarah's bluff, backed by the sheer conviction in her voice and the steady presence of Amos beside her, was enough to put the first real crack in Price's composure. "I don't believe you," Price said, though his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "Believe what you like," Amos said, standing now, his height and his stillness filling the small room in a way that made both Price and Greaves shift uncomfortably in their seats. "But you'll not have my land, or hers, without a fight that'll cost you more than whatever you're hoping to gain. And Silas," he turned his gaze to Greaves, who had gone notably quiet, "my father built this county alongside yours, and there are plenty of folks here who remember which of our families dealt fair and which one didn't. You want to test that memory in open court, you go right ahead." The meeting ended without resolution, but something had shifted in the room's balance, and both Amos and Sarah felt it as they rode home in the gathering dusk, the horse's breath fogging in the cooling air, the fields stretching dark and quiet on either side of the road. "You didn't have to do that," Sarah said finally. "Stand up for me like that. You could have let me handle it. It's my mess after all." "It stopped being just your mess," Amos said, "the day you married into this family." "That's not a burden, Sarah. That's just how it works, far as I understand it." She was quiet a long moment, watching the darkening fields pass, and when she spoke again, her voice had a different quality to it, something softer beneath the practical words. "Thomas never once stood up for me the way you did in that room," she said. "Not once in all our years married. I'd forgotten what it felt like, having someone at your back instead of always looking over your shoulder alone." Amos did not answer right away. He kept his eyes on the road, but his hand, resting on the wagon seat between them, moved just slightly closer to hers, not quite touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of it. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "Whatever else is true, that much I can promise you plain. It was not the letters from back east, though they came eventually and proved useful in their own right, that finally broke the matter open. It was something far simpler, far older, sitting in a strong box in the Calder attic that Amos had not thought of in years until Sarah's mention of a proper survey jogged something loose in his memory. His father, methodical in all things, had kept records of every boundary dispute, every neighborly agreement, every handshake deal made solid with a signed document, going back decades. Among these papers, yellowed and careful, was the original survey establishing the boundary between the Calder land and the parcel that had once belonged to a family named Ashford before it passed, through marriage, into Sarah's own family line. The survey was witnessed by 3 men, 2 of whom Amos knew for a fact were still living. old-timers who had watched 3 generations of both families work that same disputed ground. More than that, buried among his father's careful records was correspondence between the elder Calder and Sarah's own grandfather, 2 men who had, it seemed, been genuine friends, their families bound not just by shared boundaries, but by decades of mutual aid during hard winters and harder harvests. Amos found himself sitting in that dusty attic for the better part of an afternoon, reading letters written in a hand he recognized as his father's, learning things about his own family's history he had never known, a history that connected him to Sarah in ways neither of them could have guessed when they first exchanged those careful, dull, practical letters months before. "Your grandfather," Amos said, coming down from the attic with the strongbox in his arms, dust on his shoulders, "helped my father survive the winter of the bad drought, the one before I was born. Lent him seed corn he couldn't rightly spare," according to this letter, and never asked for anything back but a promise that the Calders would do the same for the Ashfords if the need ever arose. Sarah, sitting at the kitchen table where she had spent the evening mending Eli's coat, went very still. "I never knew that," she said. "My grandfather never spoke much of the years before I was born. He died when I was young." "Well," Amos said, setting the strongbox down between them, "seems the debt runs the other direction now, if debts are what we're counting. Your family helped mine survive a hard season, once. Seems only right that we return the favor now. Whatever Price and Grieve believe they're entitled to." It was this history, more than any legal maneuvering, that finally turned the tide when the matter came before the county judge some weeks later. The witnesses Amos located, old men who remembered both families with genuine fondness, testified plainly and without hesitation to the boundary as it had always stood, undisturbed by any of the doubts Price had tried to manufacture. Sarah's own witnesses from back east, arriving by letter and, in one notable case, by an unexpected in-person appearance from a woman who had once been a close friend of Sarah's late husband's sister, painted a picture of Price's methods that the judge, a practical man himself with little patience for manufactured legal complications, are by entirely too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Grieve, seeing the tide turning against his investment, withdrew his support with the swift, cold practicality of a man who had never cared about the outcome beyond its usefulness to his own ambitions. Price, left without local backing and facing the mounting possibility of his own methods being exposed to scrutiny far beyond this one county, found reasons to settle the matter quietly rather than risk the fuller reckoning that continued pursuit might bring. The debts of the late Thomas Whitfield, the judge ultimately ruled, were debts belonging properly to his failed business ventures, and the investors who had known the risks they were taking, not to a widow who had inherited nothing from those ventures beyond the grief of watching her husband's ambitions ruin them both. Sarah's family land remained hers, clean and clear. The boundary confirmed exactly where 3 generations of honest survey had always placed it. The morning after the ruling came down, Amos found Sarah standing in the yard before dawn, looking east toward where the sun was just beginning to color the horizon, her breath visible in the cold morning air. He came to stand beside her, not too close. The way he had learned was her preference in moments of quiet reflection, though these days the distance between them had grown smaller than it once was, in ways neither of them had needed to discuss aloud. "It's over," she said, not quite a question. "The trouble with Price is over," Amos said. "The rest of it, I expect, is only beginning." She looked at him then, and something in her face, freed at last from the particular wariness she had carried since the day Price's buggy first appeared on the road, had softened into something Amos had not seen from her before. Not fully, not without reservation, holding it back. "I should have told you from the start," she said. "About all of it. I let fear decide what you deserved to know, and that wasn't fair to you, or to the children." "You told me when it mattered," Amos said. "That's what matters most, far as I'm concerned, not when the truth comes, but whether a person stands by it once it does. And if I'd been guilty of what Price accused, if the debts really had been mine to answer for." Amos considered this a long moment, the way he considered most difficult questions, turning it over slowly before he trusted himself to answer. "I'd have found a way to help you carry it anyway," he said finally. That's what family does, Sarah, or what I've come to understand it means, watching you these past months. It's not about only standing beside the parts of a person that are easy to love. It's about standing through the hard parts too, especially those. She did not answer right away. Instead, she reached out, and for the first time since her arrival on that station platform, months before, she took his hand in hers, not as a gesture of practical partnership, but as something else entirely, something neither of them had quite been ready to name until this particular cold morning. With the sun rising, slow and steady over the fields they had together fought to keep whole. The seasons turned the way seasons do, indifferent to the particular struggles of the people living beneath them. And yet somehow on the Calderland, each turning seemed to carry its own small proof that something had changed for good. The wheat came in heavy that next harvest, heavier than Amos could remember in years. And though he was not a man given to superstition, he found himself thinking more than once that good land seemed to know when it was being tended by hands that had finally found their steady rhythm together. June talked freely now, chattering at the supper table about things that mattered to a 5-year-old with the particular intensity only small children bring to small matters. And though Amos still sometimes caught himself listening to her voice with a kind of wonder, remembering the silence that had once filled that same chair, he had mostly stopped bracing himself for that silence to return. Eli had taken to following Amos and Sarah both through their respective chores, splitting his questions evenly between his father's steady practicality and Sarah's plain-spoken patience, and more than once Amos caught himself smiling, unguarded at something his son had said. Unremarkable moment that would have seemed impossible in the hollow years right after his first wife's passing. Sarah's land, the parcel that had caused so much trouble, remained hers by law, but had in practice become simply part of the larger rhythm of the Calder property, worked jointly, its harvest folded into the family's shared accounts without either of them making much ceremony of the arrangement. It was not about ownership anymore, not really. It had become the way most things between them had become. A practical matter that carried a weight of meaning neither of them needed to speak aloud to understand. There was a particular evening, late in that first full autumn, after the trouble with Price had finally settled, when Amos found Sarah in the room where the crib still sat in a corner, the same oak crib he had built before he had any notion of who might one day fill his house with the sounds of a rebuilt family. She was standing beside it, one hand resting on its rail, looking at it with an expression Amos had learned over the months to read as something between memory and hope. "You built this," she said. "Before you ever wrote that advertisement, I built it for a child that never got the chance to use it," Amos said, coming to stand beside her. "My wife was carrying when she took ill. We lost them both, close enough together that I never rightly separated the two griefs in my mind. I kept the crib anyway, couldn't bring myself to take it apart." Sarah was quiet a long moment, her hand still resting on the rail. "I wondered why it was here," she said. "I didn't want to ask. Some things a person has to offer up on their own, in their own time." "I know that better than most these days," Amos said, and there was no bitterness in it, only the particular gentleness of a man who had learned, through hard practice, the value of patience with another person's private griefs. She looked up at him then, and something passed between them that had been building slow and steady since that cold morning after the ruling, since the long months of shared labor and shared silence and shared trust, built one ordinary day at a time. "I'd like to fill it," Sarah said someday. "If that's something you'd want to." Amos did not answer with words right away. He reached out and took her hand, the same way he had that morning in the yard, and this time neither of them let go. For a long while, standing together beside the crib that had waited 2 long years for exactly this moment, this quiet, unremarkable declaration that carried more weight between two practical people than any grand speech could have managed. It would be another year before that crib finally held a child, a daughter they named for no one in particular, except the season she arrived in, born in the same golden weeks as the wheat harvest that had grown so heavy and full on land that two families, once strangers, had fought together to keep whole. By then, the county had mostly forgotten the scandal of Price's visit, the way small counties forget most things once the immediate drama has passed, though there were those who still spoke, now with a kind of grudging respect rather than gossip, of how the widow Sarah Calder had stood her ground against city lawyers and local ambition alike, and won. Amos never did become a man of many words, even in the fullness of the years that followed, but he did not need to be. He showed his love the way he always had, through steady hands and reliable presence, through cribs built before hope had any right to exist, through standing firm in a small room against men who believed money could buy whatever they wanted, through the particular tenderness of a father who had learned to listen for his daughter's silence and his son's questions with equal patience. And Sarah, who had come west, believing she was simply looking for a household in need of steady hands, found instead something she had stopped believing was still possible for her, a home where her whole history, hard truths and all, could finally rest without fear of judgment. A family built not on the absence of secrets, but on the particular strength of what happens when secrets once revealed are met with standing ground instead of retreat. The crib sat in that same corner for years afterward, worn smooth by 3 more children who came after the first. Its oak darkened with age and use, and sometimes on quiet evenings when the work was done and the fields lay dark and full beneath a rising moon, Amos would find himself standing in that doorway, watching Sarah settle one child or another into sleep, and he would think back to the man he had been the day he wrote that first careful letter east. A man looking to fill a practical gap in his household, never imagining that what he was truly building, one plain and steady day at a time, was a home. His broken family had long ago stopped believing they deserved to have again.